Welcome back to Seek Growth, our 7-week personal growth, exploration, educational thing. And we're in week 2. We're in between Passover and Shavuot. Passover, freedom. You make your own choices. Shavuot, responsibility, the receiving of the Torah, the idea that we have to prepare for that responsibility. And one of the ways we do that is by using these 7 weeks to grow in a variety of ways. The Kabbalists thought that the qualities of God, the seven of the most important qualities of God, reflect in a certain sense 7 qualities of humanity. And last week we explored kindness. It was an extremely, entertaining episode, and also meaningful and ingenious, if we may say. Thought-provoking. And this week we're looking at fairness. And for those who are confused, we are, at this moment, we're on spring break, pre-Passover, and Dr. Holton and I, Rabbi David, are here on vacation, dressed very casually. We might sound as formal as we normally do, but for those who might be watching on video, because we are both audio and video recording this in 2 separate devices.
We're high tech.
And this is our first attempt at video. We didn't even lose weight or shave for this event. However you're consuming this media.
Cast.
Yeah. However you're consuming it, we hope that it's a good experience. And today we're talking about fairness. Let me say a little bit something about God's fairness, and then we'll talk about
jump into your story.
Yeah. So, first I'll say that we have this idea that comes from the tradition of din or gvura, which is the idea that God is just and fair in a universal way. That it doesn't matter who you are or what situation you are, God's justice, the divine justice, is fair to everyone. It's equal, and it's not contextual. That's this idea. And obviously in the human realm, fairness is really complicated. Do you want to say anything about justice, fairness yet, or should I go into the story?
I think, just from a psychological point of view, I think the piece you mentioned about it not being contextual is so important. I think that's one of the themes that we're going to elicit throughout this next, 10, 15 minutes or so. But just, some of the big takeaways from the psych side are that, fair-minded individuals are likely to be, more pro-social. So I think there's a close tie-in to what we talked about last week with acts of kindness. Like it should incentivize us to be fair and to try and cultivate that fairness.
Okay, and one of the most complicated things, as this first story and others will show, is that people can look at the same situation and one says it's fair and the other says it's unfair, and then whatever. The fairness is just defined really differently by people. And we'll get to what our, not just the stories and what fairness is as a character strength, but also how we want people to use this week in the 7-week period to try to think about and cultivate fairness. Okay, so we have a few stories here. Most of them are from sports. And just as background, Dr. Holton is a very talented world-class athlete.
and not world-class.
And he was all Midwest back in his soccer days. And I, Rabbi David, I could never play any sports, but I really like talking about them. So Holden and I don't know how long ago, a while ago, found that we love talking about sports and the ethical and social and psychological issues that sports raises. So we're going to have at least 3, or we'll see what happens, but we're going to have a few sports stories. So I'm going to start with one. So the first year I was at Milken, 2015, 2016. 2 of my students were on the JV volleyball team. I'm not going to mention any names until we get permission. Then maybe we'll put the names back in.
They know who they are.
They know who they are. Yeah, we'll send it specifically to you. Two of my students came to me with a question. They said, we're in our volleyball game. It's a close game. And it's a girls' volleyball, JV, 2015, 2016. And these girls said that the umpire called a ball a spike, that the other team spiked. The umpire called it out, so Milken got the point. They were awarded the point. As soon as that happened, the coach of the Milken team went up to the umpire and said, I had a better view than you, umpire, and actually the other team's spike was in, and the other team should get the point. So the students came to me, and they said, Rabbi, it's not fair. We should get the point because the umpire gave us the point. Our coach should not have told the umpire that it was only fair for the other team to get the point because the ball was actually in. So the coach on the one hand and the players on the other were looking at the same situation. A ball was out, it was called in, and the coach goes and says it was really out. No, it was really in. The question is, what's fair? Is it fair for the Milken students to get the point because that's what the umpire initially called? Or is it fair for the opponents to get the point because that's what truly happened? And the coach and the players were at odds, saying that each side of them knew what was fair and the other side was wrong. So they came to me as a rabbi and teacher, and they said, we want you to write to the volleyball coach, these students, in support of our position, that what she did was unfair because we should have gotten that point. And being the compassionate and new teacher at Milken and trying to become popular among the students or something like that, I did that. I sent a letter to the coach saying that these students are right. You don't have to be super honest in the context of volleyball if it means that it's not best for your team. You don't have to volunteer information that's not required. That's beyond general honesty, fairness, etc. And so this is 3 years ago. And going back to the letter that I wrote to the coach, I sort of cringed. And I'm like,
Can you read some of it to us?
I'll read some of it. And I think that I fell in a typical trap where people seem to sacrifice their own interests, in my case, wanting our team to win. They sacrifice actual fairness in what they believe in for their own interests. And I wrote, sports are different from life. The point of playing is to win, not to express values such as truth, justice, compassion, fairness, etc. So if the rules explicitly state that a coach must always report the truth, even if it is to her team's detriment, then the coach must do so. But if the rules don't require that of the coach, then the coach can and should quietly withhold truthful information if it is to the benefit of her team.
So I have two questions for
you. Wait. So I'll say in the past, this was October 7th, 2015 at 12:31 p.m., a month after I started at Milken, 2 months after, I was expressing the position that fairness does not require us to be super honest. Yeah, so what do you say?
So my questions are, well, first and foremost, how did the coach respond? If you can even share that.
You know what? That's an interesting question. I think the coach, I'm not sure if I had her correct email address, but I talked to her about it. And the coach, we'll call her Coach Zaki, okay? So Coach Zaki, that's not her real name. Coach basically said to me when I talked to her, not in writing, but I talked to her in person, she basically said, I have a sense of what's just and what's fair. And doesn't matter whether that benefits my team or benefits the other team, I'm going to express that position. She was expressing what is considered in the Jewish tradition and in modern positive psychology, like what fairness is. Not letting your personal feelings about whether you want to win or lose cloud your vision of what's right, what's fair, what's just. And in that sense, she was onto something.
She was saying, to the best of my ability, I'm trying to be unbiased in my application of fairness.
That's right. Fairness is basically, the definition, in a certain sense, is being unbiased when you are deciding matters of justice and fairness. Once you are doing things for your own benefit, you're no longer being fair, you're being
So my second question,
Yeah.
I think, is related to that. You mentioned that looking back on it years later now, you cringe a little bit. Is that why?
Right, because I am looking for Talmudic justifications for our teams to win. And winning is very important to me, but I think that I was sacrificing the value of fairness to a certain extent. I was like, well, that doesn't really apply in sports because, sports are about winning. And now I might think about it differently. But I don't know. We'll see what our listeners and viewers have to say. All right, so I laid out the volleyball story, which was one of my favorite episodes of my work here at Milken. So, Dr. Holton, what's your reaction? What do you think?
Well, I mean, one, I can closely relate to that sort of story. You and I have talked about it before, but I coached club soccer for a long time, and I've had similar experiences in the past where, on the rare occasion where I conducted myself like Coach Zaki, we're calling her, I believe, right? But more so where I reacted maybe kind of like you did in your story, right? Where I let my personal biases get in the way.
Okay, so you feel you do feel that tension between like our values of fairness and justice and what we would do in the abstract, and when we're involved in the situation and invested.
Right. 100%. I think in many ways that's coming from, the perception that if we are being treated unfairly, unjustly, on some level, evolutionarily speaking, like that's a threat to our survival, right? We want to make sure that we're getting what the person next to us is getting. Otherwise, maybe, their chances of survival are greater than ours.
Eye for an eye. What
Right.
someone else is getting is what I'm getting. If the other team is being unfair, I'm going to be unfair. If
Right.
other people are cheating on this test, I'm going to cheat on this test. That's fairness. But the real version of fairness in the definition of like the universal, unbiased, whatever, is the opposite of that. Like fairness.
That's right.
Fairness, as we're defining it from the character strength textbook, is not allowing your bias and your involvement in a situation to cloud how you think about it.
That's right. It's treating all people. The VIA Institute would say the same. I might take a little exception to that, but basically the idea is treating people fairly and not letting feelings of bias affect our decisions about how we treat people, right? Giving everyone a fair shake. It's care-based, it's justice-based, it's moral reasoning on some level.
Okay, so are we going to go into another story?
Yeah, I think we should. We'll talk about, sort of the three types of fairness in a minute, but I think we can situate those best through the stories. I do want to add, too, I think just commenting that this is really innate. I think this is what most human beings, or really most mammals in general, experience. We talked about, like, the famous capuchin monkey video, and I showed it to you a little bit, but you also mentioned, the reaction of your children.
My children are no better than the monkeys, it turns out. But that's okay. They're 2 and 4, and we're trying to teach them, that fairness isn't always about equality.
Yeah. Even getting the same thing. Right?
Yeah.
Will you just briefly share the story? You just came back from camping, right?
Yeah, I came back from a trip, and I brought 2 T-shirts, one for my 2-year-old son, one for my 4-year-old daughter. I gave my son the yellow shirt, and he's really happy with it. Then I give my son the pink shirt, and she's really happy with it. But as soon as my son with the yellow shirt sees my daughter has the pink shirt, he throws down his yellow shirt, starts crying, goes to grab the pink shirt, and in his own way says, "This is not fair. She got pink, I want pink." Because his idea is that, well, he's reflecting a feature of fairness, which is everyone should be able to get the same thing.
Right.
If she got pink, you should get pink. They only had one pink left, but otherwise I would have gotten him pink.
And similarly in the the capuchin monkey video, right? The first monkey that's being rewarded with cucumber, it has no problem with the cucumber until it sees that the other monkey gets rewarded for the exact same task with grapes, right? A far better food, the sugar rush, all that sort of stuff. And then all of a sudden the first monkey is ticked.
That's right. So the monkeys or the savior children are all the same. And this next story that I'm going to tell comes from a book, and it's really about how we handle an inevitable fact of life, which is unfair. Life is unfair. How do we handle that?
The yellow shirt and the cucumber. Right?
The yellow shirt and the cucumber. Okay, so life is unfair. Here's a story. This comes from well, my favorite novel called Infinite Jest. And in this novel, which takes place largely at a tennis academy, the 12th grade tennis prodigy is giving a lecture to the ninth graders about how to act on the court etiquette. And he says, like, what happens if the player across the net from you starts calling all of your serves out, even though they're in? And so the player is basically trying to cheat and win. And Hal, the senior player, says, basically, no matter how unfair and unjust the other player is, you still have to stick to the principles of fairness and justice. You do not reciprocate. You don't call his balls that are in out just because he's doing that to you. You practice fairness, which is making the right call for all of his shots. And the line that I really love is, what do you do in this situation where the other guy's being unfair and you are being fair? You're practicing justice, the other person isn't. Try to learn to let what is unfair teach you. Learn lessons from situations in life that are unfair, but don't stoop to the level of being unfair yourself. Continue to be unbiased, making the right calls on the tennis court, etc.
Okay, so there's a lot going on in both of these stories, right? The tennis story, the volleyball story, but also with the monkeys and the children, Sager. Right?
The monkey children.
The monkey children, right? So what we got to do is we got to talk about the three kind of types of fairness that I think people tend to think about and react to most viscerally. So the first one is procedural, right? This is the idea that the methods being used to arrive at an outcome are in some way, shape, or form unfair, right? So in the tennis story, this is the reason somebody might react poorly to it is the method is we get to call our own out of bounds calls, right? Okay, I get to make the decision. They get to make the decision. There's nothing I can do about that. That's the procedure. That's the method. And in this case, it's being used unfairly, right? The second type is distributive fairness. And this is basically like, regardless of how we get there, is the resolution fair, right? So proponent of, I teach RCG as well, proponent of affirmative action would argue that this is distributively fair, right? That ultimately you're compensating or correcting for a past wrong and the resolution is fine, right? I think that would have been Coach Zacky's argument, right? That the resolution is correct. The ball was out. We need to tell the umpire that it was out. That's the correct resolution, and that is fair.
The method of going about correcting the umpire isn't what you're going for. The coach doesn't want to walk around correcting the umpire.
Right.
But if the outcome is the wrong outcome and it's therefore unfair, in that case, you do try to correct the umpire.
That's right. And I think there's an interesting sort of like juxtaposition, maybe tension with the third type of fairness, which is interactional. So interactional fairness is basically, are people treated with dignity and respect, right, when policies and procedures are implemented? You might make the argument that Coach Zacky showed up the ref in that scenario, right? Like, sorry, you made the wrong call. I have a benevolent agenda here, right? I want to accomplish a good thing, but to do so, I kind of have to make you, I have to demonstrate you were wrong. I have to kind of make you look bad in a certain way, shape, or form, right? Now, we didn't talk about the story, but a lot of times, being I think people on campus that students feel like they can come to, we hear a lot of stories about, oh, this teacher treats me this way, that way, right? They usually don't use names. They just kind of say I'm being mistreated. That's another example of interactional fairness.
A student says, I'm being singled out and graded more harshly. It's not fair.
Right, exactly. So procedural is, are the methods fair? Distributive is the outcome fair? And interactional, are individuals being treated fairly with dignity and respect across policies and procedures? It's kind of it's not just interactional, but kind of institutional on some level as well.
All right, so what are so we're talking a lot about fairness. Fairness is fascinating. It's talked about all over the place. Sports, professional sports, politics. What is fairness? The procedures for getting someone on the Supreme Court. What's fair, unfair? A lot of interesting things. But for ourselves, as a way of building our own character and thinking about this process of Passover to Shavuot, of building who we are in order to receive the Torah and take responsibility as human beings and as Jews, like, what are the questions we should be asking for building our capacity to be fairness in that way of imitating God as a fair and just God?
Right. So there's a few different interventions out there, but the one that we wanted to focus on the most for this particular cast is really just a discussion, right? Facilitating a discussion around these sort of moral dilemmas, right? Putting yourself in that situation and saying, what have I done in the past? What would I do in the future? And are those things kind of in line with this definition and essence of fairness, right? Am I, or did I remove my biases and apply fairness, as objectively as possible? And so in these conversations, we want to give you a couple guiding questions, right? That might help you have these conversations around your Seder table or Shabbat table, whatever it might be, or just in a one-on-one, right? Informally. So here are the two questions we might consider, to kind of drive that conversation home. Number one, what situations challenge your capacity to be fair? Okay, this could be at school, at work, and sports, at home, with your kids, whatever.
Driving on the 405.
Driving on the 405, just what situations make it difficult for you to remove yourself from those biases, right?
And the awareness of those situations help us practice fairness and justice, probably.
That's right. Yeah, we become a little bit more meta-analytical about it. We can step back and say, okay, how am I behaving in these scenarios, right? The second question would be that when you perceive what you think is an injustice, right, how might you take action in an appropriate way that creates fairness and that allows you to use some of these strengths, right? So tying together what we talked about last week with kindness, I might argue that Coach Zaki performed an act of fairness through an act of kindness, right? To your point, she did not have to do that. Right? She did not have to be that candid and that honest. There's no rule saying you must do that, right? She went out of her way to say, not only is this unfair, but it's kind of me to make sure that I make it fair.
That's right. We'll try to get her on.
That would be great. Yep, maybe she's willing. But
and the students who came with the complaint originally.
That would also be great. Yep. Maybe we can reach out to those alumni, see if they want to contribute.
They're beloved alumni.
They are.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for listening and or watching, depending on how you consume this cast. This was the second of 7 weeks of exploring qualities of God that are also related to qualities of humanity, or ideally, qualities of humanity. And a way of us to integrate some of the ideas of the Jewish tradition with modern positive psychology. This was the second installment of Seek Growth, and we hope it helps you this week, and tune in next week as well.
Yeah, I think we'll be covering appreciation of beauty and excellence.
That's next week?
I believe that's next week.
That's a good one.